December 7th, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world and brought the US into the Second World War. But why did the Japanese resort to such an attack against a powerful rival? And what did it have to do with the Japanese war in China? To understand the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor, we need to go back to 1939 and the ongoing Sino-Japanese War. By that time, the days of rapid Japanese advance across China were definitively over. In 1937, the Japanese advanced on average 29 kilometers a day, but in 1939, this was reduced to less than 1. Even more worryingly, new actors were entering the messy war in Asia. In May 1939, Soviet and Japanese forces clashed along a disputed border at Khalkhin in Mongolia. Although starting as a small-scale ambush, it soon developed into a significant battle and the most serious flare-up of hostilities between the two regional rivals. Soviet forces, led by General Georgy Zhukov, heavily defeated the Japanese. The defeat was a blow to Japanese self-confidence and revived their fears of a Soviet attack in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek hoped that the Soviets might finally intervene directly in the Sino-Japanese War. But unexpected diplomatic events surprised both Chiang and the Japanese. On August 24, 1939, the Nazi German and Soviet governments announced the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact. This deal made Japan even more afraid of a Soviet attack, while for Chiang, it suggested the Soviet Union would no longer intervene on his side, since Germany would oppose a Soviet strike against the Japanese. Chiang's worries turned out to be more realistic. The pact helped end the Khalkhin violence, and the Soviet Union shifted its focus to Poland, which they'd secretly agreed to divide with Germany and the pact. The outbreak of the war in Europe in September caused mixed reactions in Japan. Some militarists took heart at German expansion and success, but some senior civilian politicians feared being pulled into a foreign war. Within the Japanese leadership, a split began to form. This all occurred against the backdrop of spiking global tensions, and it now became more important than ever for Japan to end the quagmire in China. Japan was still gaining ground. It had captured Nanchang in May and Nanning in November 1939, but this didn't bring victory any closer. Japanese forces were still overstretched and burdened with a vast territory to occupy and repress. But for Chiang, World War II provided a political opportunity if he could position the Sino-Japanese War within a wider global conflict. Frankly speaking, our purpose in resisting Japanese aggression is to have the war ended with the war in Europe and the World War at the same time. The Sino-Japanese problem is not simply the problem between China and Japan. It is a problem of the whole of East Asia and also of the whole world. Chiang's goal was to get more international support for his nationalist forces. Ever since the Japanese invasion in 1937, the Chinese earned some international sympathy, especially from Britain and the US, and the nationalists tried to get their message out via Western journalists and academics. But more importantly, Chinese nationalists relied on international support for equipment, especially artillery and heavy weapons. After Hitler stopped German assistance to Chiang in 1938, the Soviet Union stepped up as China's primary supplier, providing enough armaments for 20 divisions, although the USSR reduced its assistance after the Nazi-Soviet pact. Instead, Britain, France, and the US stepped in to help China. The UK and France prioritized Europe, but they did send supplies to the nationalists via French Indo-China and the Burma Road. US President Roosevelt facilitated a private loan of $25 million to Chiang for arms purchases in September 1939, and many private citizens also contributed. Retired US Lieutenant General Claire Lee Chennault helped form the Chinese Air Force from 1937 and created an American volunteer group of US airmen, later known as the Flying Tigers once they saw action in 1941. But supplying Chiang was tough. The Burma Road was dangerous, slow, and rife with corruption. The overall amount of supplies that was sent were also comparatively low. By 1941, the US had authorized 821,000 tons to Britain for its war effort, but only 16,000 to China. Maintaining even this level of foreign aid was a challenge for Chiang. He had to compete against pressing issues elsewhere and present an image of a unified and competent government that could defeat the Japanese. To do this, he launched a series of counteroffensives across China in winter 1939. Supported by up to 500,000 troops, the attack didn't get far and showed a chronic inability to combine arms. However, it did contain Japanese advances from Nanning and showed China was taking the initiative. Fortunately for Chiang, 1940 brought more problems. The German invasion of France further distracted international attention, and worse still, Japan was still advancing and moving to strangle the nationalist supplies. In July 1940, Prince Fumimaro Konoye became Japanese Prime Minister. Faced with economic troubles and even food shortages in Japan, his government wanted to exploit Chinese resources. But to do this, they needed to end the war and defeat a China being supplied from abroad. Japanese military planners had been considering this problem for a while. One supply route was the Haiphong-Yunnan Railway starting in French Indo-China. In September, Japanese troops occupied northern Indo-China after Vichy French authorities refused to cut the railway and grant Japanese transit rights through the colony. After initial clashes, the Vichy French authorities signed a deal agreeing to Japanese demands. In reality, the Japanese army made the move without official orders from Tokyo, but the government approved after the fact. Japanese diplomats also pressured the British into temporarily closing the Burma Road for several months. These moves may have cut Chiang's supply routes, but it also brought Japan into closer conflict with the USA. Following the Indo-China occupation, President Roosevelt introduced the first ever US peacetime draft and the first economic sanctions on Japan, including export limitations on scrap metal and aviation fuel. The growing animosity between Japan and the US also pushed Japan further towards the Axis powers. In September 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany, a defensive military alliance mostly aimed against the United States. Support in Japan for the pact was not unanimous, though, and senior Navy officers felt a German alliance only increased the risk of war with America. Meanwhile, Chiang had problems closer to home as well. The Chinese United Front officially allied Chiang's nationalists with Mao Zedong's communists, but it was under pressure. By mid-1940, Mao warned his generals not to trust Chiang. You should not have any further false hope about the nationalists. Do not rely on them to help you with anything. If you end up being attacked by the nationalists on one side and the Japanese on the other, it will be extremely dangerous for you. By August 1940, the Communist 8th Route Army had grown to around 200,000 troops. Although including support, guerrilla, and militia troops, the number may have been as high as 500,000. With these forces, the Communists launched the 100 Regiments Offensive, one of their few conventional campaigns of the war. 104 Communist regiments moved against the Japanese and collaborationist forces in northern China. Although the offensive did not retake any key cities or territory, the Communist forces inflicted an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 Japanese and collaborationist troop casualties and devastated the Japanese-held infrastructure. The Japanese responded with a major counterattack and retaliation against civilians, including with poison gas. After the offensive, Japanese General Yasuji Okamura implemented the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Even though the Communists had attacked the Japanese, Chiang was concerned about Mao's growing power. Tensions reached a head in January 1941 when Communist and Nationalist forces clashed along the demarcation line between their areas. There's still extensive debate, especially between Taiwanese and mainland Chinese historians, about who attacked first, but after fierce fighting, the Nationalists prevailed. Officially, the United Front held, but practically, it was all but dead. Meanwhile, in Europe, German fascism seemed unstoppable. This combination of geopolitical fears and the lure of expansion fundamentally shifted Japanese strategy. Firstly, it's important to remember the Japanese civilian government in Tokyo had only limited control over the military, especially the army in China. Military ministers wielded powerful influence and the ability to essentially veto government policy. Under Prince Konoe's war minister Hideki Tojo, the imperial army became especially powerful. Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, although supporting the Tripartite Pact, also recognized the military dictated its signing. The army is the playwright of the pact, and I am a mere actor. Unlike the Japanese Navy, who were concerned about the US, the Japanese Army's primary concerns were China and the USSR. In April 1941, they found a diplomatic solution to at least one of their problems when Japanese leaders signed a 5-year neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. The goal was to avoid a war with the Soviets while simultaneously fighting the Chinese, but the pact also freed up large numbers of Japanese troops for operations elsewhere. And Japanese army leaders had long been discussing where they would put their troops to use. One potential area of expansion was Southeast Asia and the European and American colonies of Malaya, Sarawak, the Philippines, and Dutch East Indies. These colonies, whose masters were now distracted in Europe, were rich with natural resources, especially rubber and oil, which Japan needed for the war in China. Capturing them in a so-called Strike South would also highlight Japan's role as the masters of a new Pan-Asian empire free from white imperialism. But Navy leaders were concerned about US industrial might. In June 1940, the US announced plans to increase naval tonnage by 70% within 8 years. Congress approved a program of 257 new ships at the cost of $131 billion in today's money. Japan simply could not keep pace industrially, so Japanese naval planners highlighted December 1941 as the moment the balance of power would be most in Japan's favor. Even so, Japan would have to strike first and maintain the momentum. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku felt the situation was urgent. "We must strike the US fleet a blow at the initial stage, and afterwards destroy each fleet as it sets out to keep the Americans from rising to their feet. Otherwise, Japan, with its inferior national strength, will be increasingly at a disadvantage as time goes by." However, even the Navy was divided. Many senior officers, especially those who'd studied the US Navy closely, felt war with the US would end in disaster. But most junior officers were not so worried. German success ignited their appetite for expansion, especially the invasion of the USSR in June 1941. With Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union either occupied or isolated, one Japanese leader commented, "This is a golden opportunity that comes once in 1,000 years." These junior officers, taken as a whole, could and did influence high-level decisions. Known as bakuryo, or officers behind the curtains, they pressured, intimidated, and influenced their superiors, including by not following orders. Senior leaders were sometimes reluctant to punish insubordination, especially when it was supported by the wider officer class. Meanwhile, Japanese advances in China had slowed down, so officers were eager to earn success and promotions elsewhere. In July 1941, Japanese troops completed the occupation of South Indo-China. For the US, it clearly showed a Japanese intention to project influence and perhaps military might further afield. With significant anti-Japanese sentiment building at home, President Roosevelt introduced fresh sanctions, including freezing Japanese assets and an oil embargo. Since 80% of Japanese oil came from the US, this was a significant blow to Japanese domestic and military supply. Japanese ministers expected reserves to dry up within 2 years. And so, as German troops pushed towards Moscow and Europe, Japanese leaders were discussing their own offensive operations in the Pacific. Some had reservations, but military failures in China, US sanctions, and pressure from junior officers added fuel to the fire. After the announcement of US sanctions, the Japanese cabinet held an emergency session. The result was the outline of national policies in view of the changing situation. Although not officially a decision for war, it was the first time expansion south was written into an official document. Our empire will continue its efforts to effect a settlement of the China incident, and will seek to establish a solid basis for the security and preservation of the nation. This will involve taking steps to advance south. Japanese leaders had been developing concepts of southern expansion for decades, but previously these avoided provoking other nations. But from August 1941, military planners drew up invasions of neutral Thailand, British-ruled Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, Borneo, and Hong Kong, the US-controlled Philippines, as well as the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and multiple Pacific islands. However, at another conference in September, imperial intervention shocked ministers. Emperor Hirohito broke his traditional silence by reading a poem espousing global peace and called for renewed negotiations. But negotiations were already at a deadlock. US Secretary of State Cordell Hull was adamant that any deal depended on Japanese withdrawal from China and Indo-China. Meanwhile, Roosevelt was unlikely to accept any deal which abandoned Chiang, especially as the Americans saw Chinese resistance as a component of a global war. A Chinese collapse could spell disaster for the Soviet Union and allow for a Japanese stab in the back, despite the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact. Although Prince Konoe thought about a withdrawal, War Minister Tojo fiercely opposed it and encouraged a military response against the US. At a conference in mid-October, Konoe tried to persuade Tojo against war, but he insisted. "We can't bow to England and the United States. We've lost 160,000 lives so far in the China incident. If we go on talking, we'll lose our chance to fight. We're already losing valuable time for operations." As a result of the deadlock, Konoe resigned his position and Tojo took over as combined Prime Minister and War Minister. The Japanese decision for war was now all but sealed. On November 1st, after a marathon 17-hour conference, Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada finally gave his support for a strike south. Tojo privately announced negotiations would end December 1st, followed shortly by military action. In late November, Hull issued a final offer to the Japanese: withdraw from China and Indo-China in exchange for the unfreezing of Japanese assets and a favored trade deal with the US. Although it contained no deadline, Tojo considered it an insulting ultimatum. On December 1st, Tojo reiterated the need for rapid war at an imperial conference. Emperor Hirohito listened and silently left the room, signaling his lack of opposition. The US knew of imminent attack via intercepted diplomatic cables, but did not know when or where it would take place. In reality, a Japanese strike group of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 17 other ships had already slipped into the Pacific. Their target was the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. The reasons for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor are still debated today, especially between Western, Chinese, and Japanese historians. Many Japanese still believe that US sanctions provoked Japan into attacking. But most non-Japanese historians agree that US sanctions were a reaction to the Japanese expansion that was already taking place. But why did Japan feel the need to expand south? Here again, there's a debate. Traditionally, especially after the war, historians outside Japan accused the country of seeking a wider empire simply to satisfy a desire among the elite and the masses for military expansion. These historians claim that Japan, taking inspiration from Germany, hoped to create a so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which would remove American and European influence from the Pacific and leave Japan as the preeminent Asian power. Realistically, this mostly concerned China, Southeast Asia, and India. But more ambitious versions even envisioned creating puppet states in Australia, Central and South America, the Caribbean, and parts of North America, although few Japanese leaders considered this likely. Frank Dorn, a US-China expert and former advisor to Chiang, suggested Japan was on a, quote, path of naked aggrandizement that would inevitably clash with US idealism and interests in Asia. Imperial dreams did motivate some Japanese figures, especially the influential younger officer corps. But other historians argue empire building was not a priority for senior decision makers. According to this argument, a Japanese pan-Asian empire was a beneficial side effect for Japan, but not the goal of Japanese southern expansion. These historians, like Sarah Payne, argue China was always the key Japanese issue. Southern expansion wasn't just for imperial conquest, but to gain the resources that Japan needed to win the Sino-Japanese War. This became even more vital as Japanese offensives in China failed in 1941. With the war in China costing far more than originally intended, Japanese leaders needed some kind of payback. They were willing to pursue negotiation to a limited extent, but drew the line at withdrawal from China and especially Manchuria. Simultaneously, the US refused to abandon China, which they saw as a vital component in a wider global war. Furthermore, Japan was unlikely to attack the Soviet Union alongside Germany and fully honor the Tripartite Pact, while simultaneously remaining bogged down in China. Although some Japanese leaders, especially senior naval staff, rightly concluded that a war against the US would be disastrous, they were pressured and overruled by Tojo and the more powerful army officers. Unlike the Navy, the Army had little experience with the US and underestimated its abilities. Whereas the Navy based its conclusions on quantifiable data like industrial capacity, naval tonnage, and shipping, the Army placed more faith in abstract concepts like superior Japanese fighting spirit and determination. They also expected local Asian populations would rise up to support them against the Europeans and American colonial masters. On almost all points, the Army leaders would be proven wrong. Far from ending the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would firmly connect it to the Second World War. The Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II in Asia only ended in 1945 with Japan's surrender after the dropping of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while the alliance between the CCP and the KMT collapsed again, the world entered into the Cold War and a nuclear arms race. Stalin in particular accelerated the Soviet nuclear program to achieve nuclear-powered communism and also develop nuclear weapons. If you want to learn more about this topic, in our new series Red Atoms, we explore the origins of the first Soviet atom bomb all the way to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond. And where can you watch Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators. Nebula is a platform where we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertiser guidelines, and where the viewers support us directly. This allows us to produce series like Red Atoms or our World War II series 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45. And that's not all. Apart from watching other creators' original documentaries like the Battle of Britain series from Real Engineering, your Nebula subscription also includes classes where you can learn useful skills directly from Nebula creators. In our newest class, I take you through the entire production process of a real-time history video and give a glimpse behind the scenes of what it takes to produce a great history documentary. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you get 40% off an annual subscription and support our channel at the same time. For just $30, you can watch Nebula Originals, all our content ad-free and earlier than on YouTube, other Nebula creators, and also Nebula classes and much more. And if you really want to support us and the idea behind Nebula, this December you can get the Nebula Lifetime Membership. It allows us and Nebula to invest more into original documentaries that we couldn't produce on YouTube, and to further improve Nebula and to bring it to even more platforms. And it supports us at Real Time History directly. As always, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is pursuing a policy of naked aggrandizement.